Episode 7.
After the show, don't forget to visit tell.fish/gear to get our recommendations on gear that will take your angling adventures to the next level and help make you the next Telltale Fisherman.
Welcome to the Telltale Fisherman podcast, where avid anglers share the story of their best fishing day ever to inspire yours. Now it's time for another epic adventure. So here's your host, John Woodson.
Okay, welcome to the show. Today's guest is Don Enoch. Don, welcome.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Good to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here. And Don is a good friend of mine from church, but even more importantly, he's my newest bass fishing buddy. So we've got to go out a few times here. We met a couple months ago and enjoying fishing with you a lot so
Yeah,
far.
absolutely. Thanks, John. I don't have a boat, so it's always good to have a friend that fishes and has a boat.
Yeah, that's the one thing that's better than owning a boat is to know somebody who owns one, right?
I agree. I agree.
Yeah, I've heard that. I'm just too dumb to
Take that
to not be the
yourself.
one with the boat. Oh, so well, just tell us a little bit about yourself. What you do during the week when you'd rather be out fishing.
Yeah, boy. So most of my career has been spent in sales. The last 6 years, I've worked for a company by the name of Phillips Healthcare, and I'm in marketing. So I go to an office, 5 days a week, and I spend all day in the office thinking of ways to get people to buy stuff that we build. However, one of the really interesting parts of my job is the office is on the same property as a small pond. So when the days begin to get long or gets to be a bit repetitive, I keep a fishing pole actually at my desk, and I keep a worm on it, and I will go out and throw it in the pond for 15, 20 minutes, maybe during lunch, maybe after a bad meeting or after a long day. So it's a nice way to relieve some stress.
That's pretty awesome, keeping a rod in the office. I never thought of doing that, but you got me thinking now. I need an emergency rod for when the next emergency fishing episode is ready to break out.
Well, if you ever visit me, you're always welcome to use my rod. I tell anyone that comes visit our office that if they get a hankering to go fishing, the rod's right there, the pond's out there, just go at it, and then you'll feel much better.
Just leave another worm if you use up the old one, right?
Yeah,
Bring
that's
some
right.
spare worms. Cool. So how'd you get how'd you get bit by the fishing bug? When'd you get started?
Well, so that's a great question. So interestingly enough, the men in my family, like my father, my grandfather, and my uncles, none of them were fishermen. They were not outdoorsmen at all. But I grew up in a lower kind of blue collar type neighborhood, and I had several friends that fished. But because my father didn't fish, my grandfather didn't fish, I never had a fishing pole. And I remember one day, and I was maybe 9, maybe 10 years old, and a bunch of my friends were going fishing, and I was sad because I didn't have a pole to go with, and my grandmother asked me, "What's wrong, Donald?" And I said, "Well, all my friends are going fishing, Brent and Brian and Melvin and my cousin Jeff, and I can't go." And she said, "Why?" I said, "Well, Grandma, I don't have a fishing pole." And she goes, "Well, I got a fishing pole you can use." And I thought that was kind of funny. I was like, "Yeah, sure, right, Grandma." And lo and behold, she went into her closet and came back out with a Zebco 33, which was my first fishing pole at the age of 9. So we had a reservoir down the street from us. It was on like city land, and it had bass and catfish and everything else. And back in those days, I didn't know anything about fishing. All we knew was you put a hook on there, a bobber, you dug up some worms, threw it on there, and you caught whatever you caught. One day it may be bass, next it might be a catfish, might be a brim or whatever, bluegill. You just never knew. But that's how I started fishing, and I just fell in love with it and have been fishing ever since.
Yeah, the old Zebco 33. That was the standard. I had several of those, and Caught lots of fish on them.
Oh yeah.
They did
Oh
the
yeah.
trick. So where was that you grew up?
This was in Newport News, Virginia. So
Okay.
not known to be bass capital or anything. But I don't think at that age, and in fact, for many, many years, I really even understood fishing or how to do it better. I just knew I liked being out there on the water. We would build little homemade rafts and float out in the middle of the reservoir and fish. We just, anything to get out on the water and throw a line in and see if we could catch something. And even back then, we didn't really keep them. We just kind of catch and release because we were barely old enough to know how to fish. We certainly weren't old enough to know how to clean them or anything like that. So we would just catch them and throw them back. And I remember we would play hooky sometimes and have fishing contests to see how many fish we could catch, at least until we got caught playing hooky.
Did you fish, as you got up through college and into work? And
Yeah, so I fished most of my school age years, all the way up through, I would say, high school. And being so close to the coast, we did a lot of freshwater fishing, but we did some saltwater fishing as well. I didn't do as much saltwater because, again, you had to have friends that had boats, and being in a lower blue-collar neighborhood, we didn't have any friends with boats.
Right.
We built our own rafts to go out in freshwater, but we did some surf fishing. And then when I got to college, I really didn't do any fishing. I lived in Atlanta, and I know there's good fishing there. We just didn't really do much fishing. I didn't really start picking up fishing again until I started having kids, and I wanted them to know what it was like to go fishing. And I have 3 daughters and a son, and my youngest daughter loves fishing, absolutely loves it. So I have a story I'd love to share with you.
Sure.
When she was about, I think she was about 4 or 5, and my next youngest daughter was probably about 7. We went fishing in a little pond up in Virginia. At that time, I was living in Chesapeake, Virginia, and we were catching little bluegill. They didn't have the patience to fish for bass, so I'd put a little bread ball on the end of a hook and a bobber and throw it out there, and we were killing the bluegill. And I was throwing them back, and my daughters were really irritated that I was throwing them back. And I said, "Well, what do you want to do with these bluegill we're catching?" She said, "Well, we want to take them home and eat them." I was like, "I don't know if that's a good idea," and they insisted, so I said, "Okay." And we had a bucket of about 20 bluegill, and we had been catching them all afternoon, and that's after we fed the big bird next to us, the heron,
Right.
as many as he could eat. And I took them home, and I cleaned 25 bluegill, gutted them, scaled them, and my wife cooked them all up, put them on the table. My daughters took one bite and said, "Oh my God, that's disgusting." I said, "Well, what did you think it was going to taste like?" They said, "We thought it was going to taste like fish sticks." So the lesson there is bluegill don't taste like fish sticks.
Yeah. And when your daughters say, "Bring home a bucket of fish," tell them, "Well, you got to clean it."
Yeah. Next time you clean them if you want to eat them.
Right. So what kind of fishing do you do now mostly?
So living in Florida, I love bass fishing. I don't know that I have found a lake that does not have bass in it. I mean, you can drive down the road, and I usually keep a pole in my Jeep with me wherever I go, because you just never know when you're going to find that little fishing hole. So bass fishing primarily, but I really like doing flats fishing. So I'll go out to Mosquito Lagoon, Indian River area, and I'll go out there on my paddleboard or on my kayak and fish for reds or black drum or speckled trout, whatever I can catch. Lately, it seems like I've been catching a lot of catfish, which isn't all that fun.
Not so good. No.
Not so good, but I do enjoy it. I just don't do it as often because it's a little bit further and it's not quite as convenient as calling my buddy up, John, and saying, "Hey, are you going fishing today?"
Yeah, right.
We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back to our story with Don Enoch. As avid anglers, our mission is always fishing, but at the Telltale Fisherman, our mission is to find the most epic fishing stories from around the world, and to do that, we need your help. When you share us on social media, that's like casting a line in a new pond, lake, or ocean where the next trophy fishing story awaits. Go to tell.fish, click one of our social media icons, and help cast the net for our next inductee to the Telltale Hall of Fame. And now back to our story with Don Enoch.
And the story you're going to tell us today is actually a flats fishing paddleboard story, correct?
Yeah, it is. Actually, I started flats fishing not in Florida. I started in South Carolina.
Oh.
And that's where I got the bug to fish for reds. So I don't remember how long ago it was. It was many years ago. I have a friend of mine that had a vacation home on Harbor Island, South Carolina, which is north of Hilton Head, but just south of Beaufort, South Carolina. And unless you really know that area, it's South Carolina lowlands. It's real marshy. But
Right.
this area was right just south of Edisto Beach. So when the tide changes there, you can go from having the ocean right up to the beach right in front of your house. And when the tide's out, you can have just channels all over the place that fill up with redfish.
So how big of a tide swing is it? 3-4 feet, do you think? Or?
It's not so much that it's a big swing, but that it's so low there and so flat that you can have a foot or two of tide change and it'll clear out a mile of water because it's so shallow.
Oh,
right?
wow.
So it's shallow with a lot of deep trenches. So when the tide goes out, all that shallow flat becomes ground and
Right.
land. And it's all bulrush, that grass. And when it comes up, it fills in and looks like ocean, but it may only be a foot or two deep.
Right.
So it looks like it swings a lot. It's not so much it swings a lot, it's just so shallow and so flat there. The water moves in very far.
So is it hard to find the fish when it's all flooded, but then it gets easier once the tide goes out, or?
So I found that the fish are easiest to find and catch during this tide transitions versus the slack tide, right?
Right.
So when the tide's coming in hard or going out hard, that's when they seem to be easiest to find. During the slack tide, they don't seem to be as active.
Yeah.
In this area of South Carolina where I was.
Right.
So like I said, I don't remember what year it was, but I would say it's been 5-6 years ago, probably. I was in South Carolina with a friend of mine. His name is Jack Graham, and we were there with our families, and we were there for a week. And really, I took my paddle boards because I wanted to go surfing, but evidently the surfing's not real good in this area. But what I found out quickly is the fishing is very good. And my buddy had said, we should go fishing for spot-tailed bass. I said, for what? Spot-tailed bass. I was like, well, what's that? And he said, redfish. I said, oh, redfish. So in South Carolina, they call them spot-tailed bass.
I had not heard that before.
That's what they call them, spot-tailed bass.
Oh.
They call them red drum, redfish. Down here, we always call them redfish.
Right.
But up there, they call them spot-tailed bass.
Huh.
I said, oh, so I had a couple of not really light bass poles, kind of medium heavy saltwater rigs. And I'd put basically just a drop rig with a weight on the bottom and a hook coming off, a hook or two coming off the side of it. I didn't want to go look and buy any bait, so we had a cast net. And I love cast net fishing anyways, and mullet were everywhere. So every day I'd go out and cast net for mullet, and I would just fish off the bank. And but I noticed that you could see the reds tailing up in the bulrush, but it wasn't easy to get to them without a boat. Well, I had my paddleboard. So I got my paddleboard out, and I'd never really been paddleboard fishing. So this is my first try.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And this was a pretty kind of epic scenery, right? I mean, if you think about South Carolina and just the coastlands down there, it's really beautiful. And this part is not commercial at all. So it's homes and houses. There's no commercial hotels or buildings down there. So it's a really picturesque area. And after I'd been fishing a day or two, I got this brilliant idea, like I should do this off my paddleboard, because then I could paddle up into the bulrush when the tide is in, or coming in or coming out, and fish up in the bulrush where I couldn't get to from the land. So I rigged up a pole, went out on my paddleboard, and I didn't have anything out there with me. I had no tackle, I had no pliers, nothing. It was just me, a pole, and my paddle. I obviously had not thought this through very carefully. So I did have a little bucket that had mullet in it because I knew I needed bait. And I went out there, and it was a beautiful day, as I recall. It was a little bit overcasty. I think it was maybe 4 or 5 in the afternoon, and the tide was coming in. So it had started to fill up all the shallow areas and all the channels, and the bulrush was starting to get covered. So I think it was maybe 3-4 feet deep in places. So it wasn't real deep. And I just started casting out into the bulrush, and I had been fishing, I don't know, maybe an hour and a half, and my line takes off. And when I say take off, I'm talking, it wasn't like a bass hit where you're like, it just started going. You could just hear it just zzz, and I was thinking, I got something big here. And I just let it go, and I started reeling. Now the fish is pulling me on the paddleboard, and I'm going into the bulrush, and it's pulling me through the grass. So I reel it in, and I think I got it maybe 15, 20 feet from the board, and it took a turn on me, and it pulled me off the board. So fortunately, it wasn't real deep. I was only in about waist deep water. So I held on to my pole, grabbed my board, jumped back on, and reeled him in, and the picture I showed you. So it was a nice 24, 25 inch redfish. It was beautiful. Now, there was no way I could have gotten him back to shore.
Right.
Fortunately, my buddy was out there in a kayak watching me, and he paddled up, so we were able to take the redfish off and stick it in the kayak, and he literally just stuck it in the kayak between his legs and paddled back, because we did eat that fish.
Yeah.
And it was good.
And that one was good, I bet.
Oh, it was so wonderful. We had fish tacos that night.
Better than bluegill, huh?
Better than bluegill, much better than bluegill. In fact, my daughter ate that one, and she also thought it was better than bluegill.
Awesome. So, yeah, I mean, I've seen guys who've paddleboard fished, and I've done it a little bit myself, experimenting, but I've always wondered what happens when you hook into a good fish and you're on a board like that, and apparently you go for a ride.
You definitely will go for a ride, now that was a 24-incher. I mean, I'd hate to think what would happen if you're out in Mosquito Lagoon and you hooked into one of those big 40, 50-inch monsters out there. I mean, I imagine you could go for a ride for days.
You may have an extra mile or two to paddle back to the boat launch, probably.
Without a doubt.
Thanks for sharing that story with us, Tom.
It was my pleasure.
Do you know someone who would be a great guest on the Telltale Fisherman? If so, go to tell.fish/guest and recommend them for the show. We won't bug them. We'll just give them the chance to share the story of their lifetime and become a fishing legend. Visit tell.fish/guest.
This has been the Telltale Fisherman podcast. Thanks for sharing another great tale with us. Be sure to check out the show notes page for more info on today's show and the gear we talked about. Keep those lines tight, and we'll catch you next time right here on the Telltale Fisherman podcast.